Deep in the heart of Massachusetts lie three small towns, Berlin, Boylston, and Northborough, known as the Tri-Town area. They have major highways near them. They are not immune to development, but they also have some very special landscapes. There is something wonderfully predictable about small towns in central Massachusetts, from the town common with its war memorial to the white steepled church, the bandstand, and the 19th century library that is still the center of learning for the town. There are comfortable and frequently very historic houses, a single local deli, and the old town hall has been repurposed as the Historical Society. I am Electa Tritsch, and this is Tracks in Time. We're going to explore two very different trails in this Tri-Town area, trying to understand something about what makes this area so special, learning something about the conservation efforts to protect more of the land that has recently been described as on the frontier of Massachusetts development. It's a timely story. I hope you'll join us. There's much more to these towns than the traditional town centers. Sites and structures of the water-powered mills that boosted their economy, stone walls and farm buildings, hints still of miles of farmland. There are still working farms, hillsides covered with apple trees, small rural back roads, acres of white fenced paddocks and pasture, but it's becoming rare. Ironically, the area's rich bottomland was the agent of change for these rural towns. Beginning in 1897, the land was stripped, buildings removed, and 4,200 acres along the Nashua River were flooded to create Wachusett Reservoir and a pipeline of fresh water for Boston. Farming wasn't dead. Pastures and orchards lived on in the uplands.
All three towns, Northborough, Berlin, and Boylston, in the 50s, I remember they were virtually dairy towns, apple orchard towns. Berlin had 21 operating dairy farms at that particular time, and hog farms around, and it was real woodsy, real country living.
The reservoir had another impact on the Tri-Town area. Abandoned fields became meadows. Pasture reverted to woodland.
Ball Hill, Barnes Hill, Rack Meadow, East Woods, that big area up there, which up until 30 years ago, if you took an aerial photograph, it'd be one big wilderness. The only place in the area I know of where you can get down in there, and if there's no wind blowing and it's silent, you can't hear automobiles. It's very quiet.
First, we're going to explore the trail from Berlin through Eager Woods down into Boylston and Rack Meadow. Come with me and let's see what we can find. On our way to the Rack Meadow Trail, just off the road there's evidence of a large barn that was. A little farther down off the road, you see the tumbled remains of a larger foundation. This was likely the house on its little terrace that went with the barn we just passed. That tired barn and the stone walls near it are evidence of the pastures that are now overgrown, reverting to woodlot. That doesn't mean it isn't still used. Eager Woods, managed and owned by the Berlin Conservation Commission, is even today being timbered. The vivid orange sign on this tree is the permit for logging. And the rough track through the woods with the brush abandoned on both sides is more evidence of the work that's being done. We're not going to take that track. We're going to go farther west and see what we can find in the vicinity, we hope, of Rack Meadow. Actually, the first thing we find is an almost buried stone wall, not much like the ones we just saw by the road. This is a tossed wall, and it's evidence not of pasturing, because cows and even sheep can happily eat around rocks, but of agriculture. On this trail, the signage is a whole lot subtler than it is on Mount Pisgah, as we will see later. Little pieces of flagging tape on a passing dead branch are all we have to reassure us that we're still on the right track. Eventually, the trail starts slanting downward. Now we seem to be getting somewhere. We can see in the distance a ridge, and there's a significant gap between us and that ridge, which I'm thinking must be Rack Meadow. That's a red squirrel fussing about something. Those are turkeys. And there's a dog with a bell. We zigzag back on an even less identifiable, but definitely a human trail, not just a deer walk, wondering whether there's any way to get to the meadow itself without actually cutting cross lots, which I, not an orienteer at heart, am hesitant to do. And lo and behold, down the slope on our right, we come across water. That has to be a flooded part of Rack Meadow. We'll stick to the trail a little while longer. Rack Meadow's protected environment provides havens for all sorts of wildlife, from endangered bitterns to salamanders, river otter to white-tailed deer, eagles to pileated woodpeckers and their families. Our short visit turns up nothing quite that exciting, but as we walk farther, we begin to see signs of why there is so much water in Rack Meadow. Saplings carefully felled by beavers. The birch seems to be a favorite. I wonder if it's tastier as well as good construction material. A tidy dam. The dam zigzags its way across what once was a brook, tied into the great fallen tree in the center. But look downstream. There's another dam, again laced between the trees that mark the floor of Rack Meadow. And those trees, their bark totally chewed away. Soon, girdled like that, they too will die, and eventually will fall on their own. Another whole layer of damming. Rack Meadow must have been a name that was invented once the beaver had been eliminated from this part of Massachusetts. And now, in the 21st century, it may well be returning to what it looked like 200 or 300 years ago, before the beaver were trapped and killed to provide fur for gentlemen's hats. Before we leave Rack Meadow, though, we need to stop and listen for the sounds of silence that Walter mentioned. Oak leaves, pine boughs, trickling water. It is a very peaceful place in late November. Our second walk is going to be the other end of the mid-Massachusetts woods spectrum. Instead of going down to a dark and beautiful place, we're going to go up. We'll take the summit trail on Mount Pisgah and see the incredible views on the other side. This time we join a group led by Sudbury Valley Trustees Krista Collins.
I guess I don't.
It's hard to hear a trail when you're in a group, but there are always shared discoveries to make up for it.
Well, we have moisture collecting in this crotch right here, and it's following down the crack here. But as it gets down here, because of the organic matter, you have slime flux.
Slime flux? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
All these great terms.
Yeah.
And she was saying that when she was growing up, Smith Road was a dead end.
Yeah.
And that's where all the kids went to party.
When we first came in, there's a big flattish area. That's where the motorcycles pitch their
you
tents.
speak from personal experience?
No, this is rumors.
I'm not old enough to know that.
No one ever has.
So, but she said, she remembered when it was all woods back there, none of the houses were there, and then when they punched the road through, a lot of more houses went in. But
Only on the other side, because this side is all conserved.
Yes. A lot of orchards and a lot of dairy farms. So this may have been, there were a couple of families that had owned a lot of land in this area.
An old pasture leaves a wide-spreading pine as evidence, and the stone walls that surrounded it. A rutted wood road is part of another story.
One out, and so there's lots of, you can now look, and there's lots of examples of this. So this was clearly being cut for lumber. Come on, Hen.
The kids find different pastimes. Raking the forest, befriending wildlife, building teepees, hunting for gnomes. Late November doesn't necessarily mean no color at all, except oak leaves. Right at our feet are brilliant patches of almost fluorescent green, the moss that's enjoying the cool weather and the moisture of late fall. Here, right next to the path, is wintergreen. In fact, there's a whole patch of it here, along with a first-year baby pine and the dead stalks of Indian pipes. In due course, the trail heads upward, and the first huge glacial erratics appear.
This is the steepest part of our hike, but it's not that long.
Some of that has to do with leg length, I think. Or maybe just knowing which way to go. The woods open out as we approach the fabled South Vista. It does not disappoint, and for a moment we are silenced by this swath of New England beauty. Our visit ends in a study of glacial geology. Bedrock deeply scored by scraping ice, building blocks of natural split stone, and the ice-dumped boulder that crowns Mount Pisgah, and surely was a place of wonder for millennia before we came along. We head for home with tired legs, satisfied souls, and a great respect for the Sudbury Valley Trustees and their many partners in the Tri-Town area, stewards of these increasingly rare silent landscapes.